Hey Gina, on today's episode, I'd like to discuss the affordable housing shortage that we're seeing in many major cities across the United States.
Yeah, housing issues has come up for pretty much everyone. It's getting harder and harder to get a decent place with a decent amount of rent or buying a house that actually is good price for you and you're not getting yourself into really humongous debt. So it is becoming a topic for all of us to start thinking about.
Yeah, one of the things that I was in the research that I was looking at, and I've heard this, the rule of thumb for households should not spend more than 30% of their incomes on housing. But we're seeing that being a real struggle in major cities where the rent, if you're a renter, is a lot higher than what your median income. People are spending a lot more than just 30% on their rent or their housing situation.
I love when somebody says 30%, and there is no way. We have not increased minimum wage. We have not increased, in general, our income to make it match the housing market. And this is where the gap is, right? So we're looking at how much money do you actually have to put out from your income. It is not any longer 30%.
No, and that's a great point because as you said, I think rentals and home prices have been going up at a rate where economy's doing well, but I don't think that the salaries are matching up with those rates. And I think that's where we're seeing a big struggle for a lot of people.
Yeah, the medium income in United States is somewhere, of course, it varies from state to state, but we're talking about $60,000. By the time you end up paying all your bills, you pay your house first.
And when you mentioned that, it kind of got me thinking of some statistics, and I was looking at and top 20 cities with large Hispanic populations all reside in about three states: California, Texas, and Florida. And when I started looking at major cities in California, Texas, and Florida, we have Los Angeles, where you have a one bedroom averaging at $2,300 a month with a median income of $69,000. That's definitely more than your 30% that you're spending there on just rent. You have cities like Miami. Miami is a one bedroom average $1,700 with a median income of $52,000 from the metro area. You're blowing that out of the water. The one city that I was able to see major city on that top 20 list was in Texas, and it was San Antonio. San Antonio had a one bedroom average of about $1,100 with a $66,000 median income. So that did 30% or lower range for spending in rent or in mortgage.
When you know that amount that you are getting, your take home pay, it is not the 30% of your rent. It's what they call cost burden or rent burden. And it is becoming an interesting topic across the board because most people keep talking about affordable housing, but affordable housing is about income, and it goes directly to how much money you bring home and how much money you can put out. And so I love this topic because we're going to be able to tap into different themes of this topic, such as housing quality of life or housing discrimination. And you're gonna dig in and talk about gentrification. For example, something that I learned in a conversation not long ago was the zoning is the one that determines how income for price incomes or the pricing of homes are determined. And when you go back in history about 1950s, that's when zoning actually decided how to segregate our community into different classes and did go apart or away from mixed income housing. And that created a completely new way of designing communities and designing income for many, many communities.
It's interesting because in many American cities in that time frame, 50s, 60s, going to the 70s, where we saw these low income housing projects that were put together where the federal government or state government provided subsidized housing, and those were known as the projects. And they kept them, instead of like what you said, having mixed income households or mixed income communities, they segregated folks and put them into a box. Okay, because you're in this certain poverty level, you're going to stay here. One of the biggest things about those, and I don't know if it was done strategically or if it was just a result of it, or when you put people into a specific box and you say, this is where you're going to live because this is what you can afford, do they see anything else and do they aspire for anything more? So you will see, and this is a topic that I hope we can get into a little bit later, is the topic of upward mobility. So the topic of upward mobility, if someone is born into poverty, how they get out of poverty or at the rate that they get out of poverty is a really interesting topic that's come about in the last 5 years or so, maybe a little less. And I'd love to discuss that a little bit more after the break.
LatinX Point of View is brought to you by Civic Canvas, a bilingual boutique firm designing strategies for social change. To learn more at civiccanvas.com. Now, we left this conversation before break and we were talking about the income versus housing and, back in the day, the 1950s, the 1970s, and how we as a nation, we're designing neighborhoods. And interesting enough, there is a study released by Dr. Rag Chetty from Harvard University. It's called Where is the Land of Opportunity? And what he did is a 20-year retro study that analyzes how likely a person can actually move away from low-income brackets. And he determined that it's very difficult. In some of the most prominent cities that we know, if you were born there, you're more likely to stay poor. And this is actually coming to give us insight in how we're designing communities, because I've heard so many times that your zip code determines more likely your quality of life than anything else. And that's how we need to start thinking intentionally about how we design communities, and specifically how housing is designing our classes, our income, our ability to get better places or get better jobs or go into higher education, et cetera, because all that seems to be determined by zip codes.
One of the things that I realized when I was doing this research was, and it goes back to your point about how we've developed communities across the United States, and I want to go back to the 1950s with the urban sprawl. So when we were talking about major American cities, people used to live where they worked, where they shopped, where they did all these things. In the 1950s, we started seeing people growing outward into the suburbs. So we started seeing suburbs develop around major American cities, where the suburbs were housing middle, median, moderate housing to higher income households. So where you saw people kind of being pushed into or staying was in those older places that were already in that infrastructure of that major American city. In the last 40 to 50 years, we've seen a transition of those people who are in the middle income bracket and higher wanting to move back to city center of most of these cities, especially those who are at the top of those income brackets, buying in some of those rundown poorer areas and pushing those people out.
Yeah, the whole case of gentrification, because the issue now not only impacts low-income people, as we know, it's starting to impact middle class. And I mean, we know middle class is disappearing because of the gaps of income in between the poorest and the richest. And this push of housing away from middle class is really going to create that or widen that gap. Is going to create in many countries that we know of what they call the ring of poverty, where you have the richest people be able to afford high income housing, though the people who cannot afford it, it starts going into the side. And that's what they call the ring of poverty. Because if you're middle class, let's say by American standards, you are middle class, you should be able to have a place where these are some of the requirements of healthy communities. You should have good school district. You should have work opportunities. You should have good grocery stores, and you should have excellent transportation. So all those components create a really healthy community. If you're still pushing yourself into the suburban areas, your ability to access any of those items, any of those characteristics is less and less, because most of the resources are put into specific zip codes. So we're almost pushing middle class into suburban areas. And we need to start thinking if that's our solution to income mobility in this country.
One of the things that you mentioned when you regards to the middle class, so for many years, it was middle class and above we saw as being homeowners. And a lot of areas across the U.S. is that people categorized as that middle income, some of them aren't able to buy homes, which was part of that American dream of home ownership in some of these cities because of prices being way out there, and they're staying a lot longer in the renters market. And partly is what's driving those prices higher and higher is because people who normally would take that step from being a renter to a home buyer, as their wages increase, as their family stabilized, they don't have that opportunity anymore, or that opportunity is just a lot harder.
It is a lot harder. So I'm reading here is 50% of all renters spend more than 30% of their income. I believe it's getting cheaper to live at an extended stay hotel than actually have your own home. And I've seen an increase locally, and I'm sure most people will start seeing this in their cities as well, is where people are moving into motels and make that their housing. Kids are being dropped off from school buses. It's not uncommon anymore to see school buses stopping at a motel. Is that the kind of communities that we want to create? Part of my work has been in low-income communities, so I'm going to be a little bit advocating and spending a little bit of time on low income because this is very close to my heart. Part of the conversation we're leading into is the middle class and how we're pushing this middle class. And it also comes with zoning. And zoning, as we know it, if most people understand redlining, how we are creating segregated neighborhoods, not only by income, but also by race, and how this actually also affects our quality of life, because there is another study that shares that we are more likely to be better off in non-segregated communities, even if they're low income, which is very interesting. So the idea that, low income is always bad, no. Actually, if they are diverse, they're more likely to have upward mobility than any other.
One of the things that in this conversation I would love to try to tackle also is affordable but not available. So we see higher income households are free to occupy rental homes in the private market that are not affordable to lower income households. But we have seen a trend in people renting and buying in what are considered low income neighborhoods that are outside of that tax bracket in order to reach or get into that range of that 30% rule that we talked about earlier. So some people are still trying to abide by that 30% rule to be able to live the type of lifestyle that they want to live. So if you are house poor, if you are rent poor, you're not able to live the type of lifestyle that you want to live.
You know, it is about professions. And so let me step back and say this is about housing, affordable housing. And you take a step back and you say, well, this is about income. You take another step back and then you realize that the way you're designing your income, your future income, your profession will determine the quality of life. Unfortunately, a teacher cannot afford a decent home. And we're looking at other professions that are in the, let's say this, because this is my background, social sector, the public sector, who are having to travel great amount of distance in order to be able to have dream home. And not even dream home, you know, a decent, dignified home where they can raise their children in a safe environment and they have some resources available.
I had a friend who was a teacher or who is a teacher, and she would take a 45-minute commute because to be able to purchase a home on her teacher's income, she had to buy in a county outside of a metropolitan area. So she could not buy within the same county of that metropolitan city. She had to buy the next county over just because the rate's more affordable.
Yes. I mean, you're having to, what happens is once you have the middle class is pushing neighborhoods that were already affordable for low income folks. Let's say you start pushing them out. So where do people with lowest income will live? They will have to go to rural areas. And that's the kind of the forecast of how we're designing communities in the future, where you have the rich one lives in the downtown, the middle class lives in the surrounding areas, and the poor goes to rural areas, which is going to decrease their opportunity to move upwardly. And when you're looking at professions, not only that, outside of the professions, then you have your credit history or your credit score as a determinant on your ability to buy or rent housing. You know, it gets what they now changing the topic from, or the word from affordable to accessible. Because even if you have the income, you may not be able to have accessibility because of your credit history or other barriers that you may have.
And Gina, I want to touch on the accessibility point and the home ownership point after this break. That segment of the LatinX Point of View podcast was brought to you by L5 Consultants, a company committed to helping bridge cultural differences. You can find them on Twitter at L5 Consultants or on the web at l5online.com. Gina, when we talk about affordable and available rental homes per 100 households, we see that people who are extremely low income, only 35 out of 100 renters are available to rent in certain American cities. The concerning thing to me is that someone with an average median income in that area, they're only at about 55 out of 100. So we see that at a little bit over 50%. of those with an average median income can afford the available rental homes that are in their area.